Good morning. I've just been told we have to start because he needs the whole hour. Here, Professor. So we'll open with a prayer. There are sheets that are being distributed now, and if you don't get one, there's extra copies up here in the front. Today we're going to be dealing with Jerusalem, and just to mention again that all these are being placed on the internet, on YouTube. The address is in the service folder for today. It was there last week too. And it should be, you go to our website and then under education, I believe it is, and then there'll be a link to it as well. Because 1 hour did not fit in one of their time lengths, it's 44 minutes. And then there's a second one with 18 minutes or so. But all of them are listed there. So if you weren't here, or if you have relatives especially that were going on a trip, and wanted to see what transpired during these classes, you can see that on YouTube. So this is the last class. We're dealing with Jerusalem. We'll open with a prayer and then I'll give it over to Dr. Lorenz. Lord Jesus, we thank you for being with us these last weeks, giving us a greater understanding of the place where you walked, the unique country of Israel. Help us also to have that knowledge increased, as especially today we speak about Jerusalem, the holy city, the place of the temple of God, where so much has transpired in the last few thousand years. It goes beyond comprehension as we as Americans think about the history of our own country in comparison to the history of this city, Jerusalem, the city of David. Now be with us, Lord Jesus, in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor. We can't do anything better than go back to our theme, time and space, This is a map from the time of Martin Luther of the world. And you can't see it, but it's got Europa here, Asia there, Africa here, and guess what this circle is in the middle? Jerusalem. So their perception of the way God laid out the world was Jerusalem's in the center of the three continents. By the way, up here is, down here is America. It doesn't kind of fit the pattern, but this is one of the handouts. I told you you'd be using your hand. You take it with you, even if you lose the paper, you got your hand. And if you put your hand like this, and you separate this finger from the other three, you're carrying with you a map of ancient Jerusalem. And if you'll notice here, you see the hand, the outline? The thumb is the Mount of Olives. The temple is right here at the top of your hand. The one finger that sticks apart from the other ones is the city of David. That's the oldest part of Jerusalem. It goes way back to even before David. And it's there because it has a very strong spring that brings water all the time. It's called the Gihon, and some of you may be visiting it. If you see the dotted line, that pretty well indicates the walled city today. These are not the ancient walls, although some of the areas follow the ancient walls. These were walls built at the time of the Reformation by the Turks. While Luther was reforming the church, the Turks were capturing Jerusalem and rebuilding the wall. The three fingers of your hand, and then if you are like me, that you are married and you have a wedding ring, the wedding ring is really where the crucifixion happened. The temple is right at the meat of your thumb. It's something that you can take a look at and use. Somebody said they didn't know which direction was which. This particular map is north, just like we are all accustomed to. These are the various places that, okay. This dot right here, that would be this finger, the ring finger, is at the end of it is the high priest's house where Jesus was interrogated by Caiaphas. This is okay. I'm going to go fast forward. I didn't know that this one had. You aren't going to remember it anyway. And I gave you something that you can practice on. I put this in too because there are things in Jerusalem that you won't see. I looked at your itinerary, and as an archaeologist, I weep. But you won't see the city of David, where we have undeniable remnants of the great city of Jerusalem rebuilt by David in the 10th century BC. Again, this is an artist drawing, but they mentioned here the names of people who are mentioned in the Bible, whose names appear in things that have been excavated. This is the stepstone structure. You can see it right there. David, we would call it a reinforcing wall. Upon it was the palace of David. This is an artist's reconstruction of that finger of your hand that sticks down off by itself. City of David. How big is this? Not very big at all. It's hardly a city block wide and maybe about 7 or 8 city blocks long from top to bottom. Now, the reason for that was it's different than today. When we think of a city, we think of Milwaukee. Can't even tell where the walls are because if you ever look at a map, the boundaries go ketsy all over the place, right? In the ancient world, a city with walls was a place that you would escape to when you were being attacked. Very few people lived inside. People lived inside were the top bureaucrats. And so we don't see the city of David as being a big place at all, but realize that people lived in the neighborhood, in the fields and hills all around. Did you get that point? It's different than today. So cities were refuges. You will not be walking through this, which I wish you could. It's the Gihon Spring. King Hezekiah built a tunnel that brought the water of the spring inside of the city. It's about 1,500 feet long. And if you put on your whatever water shoes you have, you can walk that whole distance. I've done it a dozen or more times. It was built by King Hezekiah. It's mentioned in the book of Kings. There you can see how the tunnel doesn't go on a straight line. It's that blue line. And it empties into the pool of Siloam, which is mentioned by Jesus in the Gospels. All right, now we get to we're back to our itinerary, the one that those of you going with Pastor Krause are going to follow. You can maybe make out here, this is the walled city of Old Jerusalem. Those walls, I still was able to walk along them all the way around. Politics being what they are, you don't do that anymore. It's too bad, because it gave you a very good view of all the things that are inside and outside of it. How big is this? It's about a square kilometer. That's less than a square mile. This isn't very big at all. This is the kind of thing that you see as you came into Jerusalem the first time from Mount Scopus, and you can't miss, this is the Muslim Dome of the Rock, also known as the Mosque of Omar. and it was built in it was built in I forget the exact date, but in the 1st century of the Muslim era. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, Aqsa is Arabic for corner, and according to Muslim tradition, Muhammad was transported to Jerusalem like Ezekiel was in the book of Ezekiel, and he was riding his horse, his favorite horse, and he ascended up into heaven from Jerusalem. Now that's another class, learning about how Muslims have taken the Christian and Jewish histories and twisted them to their own purpose. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is right behind here, if you can. It's got kind of a blue dome. And the other thing that I would mention, no, I don't see it. Oh yeah, here is the Church of the Redeemer. It's a Lutheran church built by the Germans about 150 years ago. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You will not be going into it. It's all politics today. I still remember taking off my shoes and going into the mosque and watching the worship there in my student days. The western wall you will see. The western wall is simply a portion of the platform that King Herod built upon which he placed Disneyland. That's a good metaphor. Herod was not a devout believer, but he knew that if he redid the temple and did it with marble and gold and did it in an extraordinary way, it was the best temple in the world at the time, that it would draw people, and of course if you draw people you make money. We often think of Caiaphas, the high priest. One of the things that the Talmud tells us about Caiaphas is that he was venal. Venal means he loved dough, he loved money. And one of the scams was that a person would bring a sheep for an offering, and the priests were told to inspect the sheep and reject it, and then say, oh, but we have a beautiful version here grown at the high priest's own farm outside Bethlehem, and you can have it for 50 shekels. You get the point. The western wall, the women pray on this side, and the men get the big part. This is Jewish, and ladies definitely get second place. And in here, under these arches, you will find a place for prayers. You can pick up a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures. But I told him that he have to read the Hebrew without the little points, like on the bulletin this morning. That was Isaiah, just like the text, but not even many of your pastors would be able to read it. You can see the Mount of Olives in the background here. The Mount of Olives is higher, and there is a psalm that says that the dwelling place of God is surrounded by heights, hills. And this is also true at the sanctuary before Jerusalem, which was in Shiloh during the time of the judges. That also is a hill surrounded by higher hills. High hills in the Old Testament were naughty places for the pagan, sexually charged religion of the Canaanites. So God kind of picked places that weren't there. This is also called the Wailing Wall, by the way. You ever heard that? Yeah. And you'll find people will be going like this. By the way, when they pray, they bob. And it works. This is an aid to memory. I knew some Jewish people from school who had memorized whole books of the Bible in Hebrew. And I knew some Christians who had memorized whole books of the Bible in English. Have you, Pastor? I haven't.
I don't want to embarrass myself.
I put him on the spot. Now, inside the Mosque of Omar, that golden dome, is what's called the foundation stone. And you can't see it there. This is a picture of the mosque It's this particular stone. And one of my old friends, he's gone now, Leon Reichmeyer, was able to go in there and do very close measurements. And there is a carving on the top of this stone, is exact dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant. And so scholars believe that in the Temple of Solomon, this foundation stone was under the Holy of Holies. Now we go to across the city, to Mount Zion. Mount Zion are those three fingers that have the ring. And the upper room, this is a Crusader remake, but several levels. You know how the ancient cities, you build layer upon layer upon layer, and they have done some excavation. There was a shell that came and exploded during the War of Independence, or the 67 War, I forget which one, which allowed archaeologists to do some digging underneath. This is a big fact about Jerusalem. You don't dig if you don't want to start a major international incident. But when somebody throws a bomb in there and kind of messes it up, then they let the archaeologists work. And underneath of it is a synagogue, which from the writings of the early Christians seems to be the same as the so-called Church of the Apostles, and it was a synagogue. It was arranged like a synagogue. That's not surprising. Pastor has that in his sermon this morning. Synagogue simply means meeting place. And it was called the Church of the Apostles, totally obliterated, rebuilt by the Crusaders. So here's where they go and do their Last Supper stuff. This particular grave, you will be going there on your tour. It's called David's Tomb, and it's not. David was buried in another part of Jerusalem across the valley from the Kidron. We don't know exactly which one, but that's where the kings were buried. But this is what they call it today, and it's under this particular David's tomb that you have this Church of the Apostles. You will visit the palace of Caiaphas. Of course, this is not the way it looked. This is the way it looks today. Beautiful, very beautiful. This is outside the city walls. It's in those three fingers, if you look at your chart. And here is a reconstruction by archaeologists of how it may have looked. You will visit a street that wasn't there when I was a student, but has been excavated, Cardo. You have to understand, every Greek and Roman city had two streets that formed a T, and then you built the city around that. The Cardo was the north-south street, and the Decumanus was the east-west street. And usually that was a place that served like an entrepot, what do you call it? We have Brookfield Square, you know what I mean? A mall. Yeah, these were places, between these pillars they would have had people selling stuff, and this is the walkway. And this happens to be a mosaic where this Cardo is placed inside Jerusalem as a very definite thing. Was this there in the time of Jesus? No, it wasn't. This was after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and about 120 after Christ, the Emperor Hadrian rebuilt the city, banned all Jews from being inside of it. They had another revolt. There were two revolts, one in 70 that destroyed the temple, and another in 135 called the Bar Kokhba revolt. And after that, the city was called Aelia Capitolina, and above the sacred places of the Christians, the Romans built pagan temples. There was a temple to Jupiter right over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There was a temple to Venus right along next to it. You will see this portion of wall right in the middle of the old city, and it's a portion of wall from the Old Testament from about 700 before Christ, the time of King Manasseh. It's called the Broad Wall. Just gives you an example of we don't have much, but we just have bits and pieces of the old city of Jerusalem. You will visit something called the Herodian Mansion. It's on every tour guide's, and here are actually, this is what you can see. They love mosaics. Mosaics was the art of the time. Another one there. And I would say there is a pretty good chance that this is where Herod Antipas met Jesus. Remember, Herod wanted to have Jesus do a miracle, and Jesus kept his mouth shut. That's in the Gospels. Probably was this particular place. If not this one very much nearby. Now we're moving on to day 7. Your trip goes like this. On day 6, you walk. The bus drops you off, but you walk. And you look at the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, the things that we saw, Cardo, the David's tomb, so-called. That's that day. The next day, you use the bus because you're going to places in and around Jerusalem of interest to Bible students, but it takes driving. And so here you have a map. Again, it means a lot more. This is the old city. You can see it's just a postage stamp. And so you're going to go to places, I have them numbered here. The Israel Museum. I'd love to take you there because I could point out some stuff that's really neat, including there's an altar that was excavated at Beersheba where I began my archaeological work. And I can point you to a stone that I actually pulled out of the ground with my own hands. That's a special. You only get it if I'm a guy. There's a model of Jerusalem at the time of David at the Israel Museum. And if you have your cameras, you'll love to take pictures there. Right at the same place is number 2, the Shrine of the Book. When the Dead Sea Scrolls, yes sir.
I just have a question about David's tomb.
Yeah.
You give me the impression, and I know nothing, that it certainly is not David's tomb.
No.
I find it ironic that it's labeled David's tomb. And does the world believe it's David's tomb? Is that?
What was the last thing?
Does the world believe it's David? Or what I'm saying is, do many people think it's David's tomb? Is there a lot of things like that?
The tour guides do.
Well, that's for their.
Make money.
And the Orthodox Jews do.
They do.
It's a very interesting thing. Politics does strange things to the location of stuff. When pilgrims could not get across the Jordan to Mount Nebo, where Moses saw the promised land, there was a political barrier there. The politicians decided that they would take a place on the other side of the river and designate it at Mount Nebo, because you don't want to turn away pilgrims. Pilgrims got money. This is just like Herod and Disneyland. It sounds a little cynical. There's 2 things to say. Places have places don't move. And people don't usually completely disappear. So even if there was a war and they destroyed something, there'd be people who remember that's where it is. Okay? There has to be a reason to move it to someone else. That's the general rule. Places don't move. In fact, the names of places that we find in the Bible, we can find outside the Bible for 1,000 years before, 1,000 years after. The spelling may change, because sometimes the language has changed, but it's still the same place. This is a very interesting thing. It's what drew me to be a student of the Holy Land, as well as being a pastor and a missionary. All right, you're going to go to the Israel Museum, and I'll show you a couple of slides that I think is interesting. So 2, 3, 4, you go to Yad Vashem. That's modern. This is post-World War II. This is the Israel monument to the millions of people who were killed by the Nazis. And there's a special interesting place called the trees planted in the name of Gentiles. because they, like Schindler's List and stuff like that, because they protected Jews during that terrible war. Okay, Yad Vashem. That's Hebrew. It means, this is your Yad. And in Hebrew that also means your power. Your hand, your arm is what the Bible speaks of, the mighty arm of God. Okay. Shem is a euphemism for the divine name. The Jews don't want to say God's name. So Shem simply means name. So this would be the power of the name. And what they want you to do is not forget. You get a lot of that propaganda on television too. Never forget. And I hope we never do forget. The terrible, not only that, but what Stalin did to the people of Ukraine. I lived there. And the Western America never really heard about it. He starved to death 7 million people by simply forbidding them to eat. Can you imagine how cruel that is? And we all know about China and the Great Cultural Revolution. We've heard of Pol Pot in Cambodia, and we know about Rwanda. This is not the only genocide, but it certainly is one. And I think I had to work through this too, because in 1970, this is how many years after World War II? 25? I was working with Jews who escaped the Holocaust. And I don't know if you know that, but being a Lutheran immediately identifies you as a Hitlerite to begin with. They don't know better. So I had to work through that, and that's a whole other story. Also on this day, you're going to go to Herodian, the so-called burial place of Herod the Great. They haven't found the tomb yet, but they think it's there because Josephus and other writers says it's there. And then you'll go to Bethlehem, and of course there's the Church of the Nativity, something not to be missed. And you'll end the day at Ein Kerem, which pretty likely the hometown of John the Baptist and his parents, Elizabeth and Zechariah. All right, let's look. This is the way the Shrine of the Book looks. Actually, that's a kind of a replica of the cover for one of those pots that they hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's rather striking, and you can't miss it. Here, you can't read that. Even I can't read this. They have inside of there, the great Isaiah scroll, the only scroll that gives one entire book of the Old Testament. It happens to be Isaiah. Isn't that neat? It is neat. And this is the way it looks on the inside. And here you have some of these. Here you have various Dead Sea Scrolls that you can see. You'll be going into this and taking a look around. This is the Holy Land model. I told you about this. It's right outside, a short walk from the Shrine of the Book. And you can see here the temple of Herod that he rebuilt. And this is the Solomon's colonnade that's mentioned in the book of Acts. And this back here is where the Roman soldiers looked down upon the Apostle Paul when he got arrested. This would be the area outside of the temple, reconstructed. But you can see this is residences here, more substantial buildings. Something you'll enjoy looking at. The Israel Museum, this is an aerial shot, and it just simply shows you anything that really is important ends up in this museum. And I put two things here which you should be aware of. This is an amulet that was made out of silver and rolled up and worn around the neck. And it was painstakingly unrolled. And lo and behold, this is from the 7th century before Christ. You know what's on it? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. The blessing of the high priest on this amulet, which has a big impact upon the skeptics who don't believe that the religion that we hold dear actually is what it says it is. The other one is very interesting. This comes from the 10th century. It's a piece of pottery on which is written one of the earliest alphabetic scripts. And it happens to be from the time of King David, from a city called Caiaphas in Arabic, or in Hebrew, Sha'arayim, or in English, 2 gates. Why is it important? You can't believe it. What this guy writes about, you can tell that he studied the scripture because some of the phrases are taken right out of Deuteronomy about taking care of the widow and the orphan. This too was not expected by the skeptics. Here's a pic. This is an aerial pic of Kirbet Caiaphas or Sha'arayim. This is one of the few cities that has 2 gates, usually only one. One to let the enemies get through 2 doors. So, but it was from the time of King David. Elah Valley is where King David fought Goliath. There's a truth about the geography, and now we're looking at the map again. You can see this is the hill country, the coastal plains. There's the Jordan, the pink is the Jordan Valley. There's the Dead Sea. This is Judah right here. And there were these valleys that cut through from the coast up to the cities in which the Israelites lived. And you will find fortresses on both ends, usually a Philistine fortress, and the other one would be an Israelite fortress. A lot of archaeology is being done in there, and almost, I'd say 60% of the battles of the Bible were fought in that area. Yad Vashem, this is you go into this hall, again, not to forget, they have pictures there of people who were gassed in Auschwitz and other places like that. When you get to Bethlehem, and by the way, getting to Bethlehem today is a piece of work. You all heard about our president touting walls, and he talks about how the Israeli walls are 99% effective. Well, I'll tell you, they're all over the place. And I used to walk to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. You can't do that anymore. There's all these walls in between. Very confusing, even for someone who knows the land quite well. But you finally will get to a place called Manger Square, and you probably won't park there. The buses are parked off site. And right there you can see very small, there's the entrance to the Church of the Nativity. And like most places, it's an Orthodox, Greek Orthodox church. But you'll go down some stairs, down into a cave, and there you will find, oh yeah, I think these are out of order, but the shepherd's fields, you will find these sheep still grazing in the areas around Bethlehem. The sheep of today are not any different than the ancient sheep. And what's really notable about them is that they have a big fat tail. And it's full of fat. And it's a kind of a breed of I used to go to the sheep market in Jerusalem, actually, where they were buying and selling sheep. That's gone now. All right, there, you see that silver star on the 14 points? That's exactly where Jesus was born. I'll tell you, it really turned me off the first time I made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But I've since come to understand that layers upon layers and centuries upon centuries of Christians have lived in these sites. In order to show their piety, they put marble and silver, and before electricity there were hanging lights and lamps, you know. And they're all kind of grungy now, which turns you off too. But this was supposedly a cave. You won't get your whole group in that room, but everybody will get a chance to see it.
Some will have to stay at John the Baptist souvenir shop.
Oh yeah. And right outside there is the place, and this is true, where St. Jerome and his girlfriends used to live. And no, I mean, they were a platonic relationship. But that's a great story because Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in Bethlehem, even though he was a Western scholar. Now, there's the Herodium. Can you see it? It's an artificial hill. This was built at Herod's command, and then at the top of it, it's been excavated. You'll see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 towers, and yet they haven't found the sarcophagus, the actual body of Herod. It's somewhere. But if you knew Herod, you would be very much into hidden treasures and all, that kind of stuff. So they're still looking. There's a drawing of it. There was a palace fortress that's at the very top. Now they think that the mausoleum was halfway down. There was a lower palace, and then down here there's a swimming pool. Herod didn't do anything by halves. When he built something, he really built. And the amazing thing is that when he died after a 40-year reign, he left his country in the black, economically. There aren't many kings who have done that. And you know how he did it? He made sure that everything he did had a kickback. And he told the Roman Emperor Augustus, I will take care of the Eastern Mediterranean so that your grain ships, it's like the oil today, your grain ships will get to Rome. And Augustus liked that, so he gave him a monopoly on the salt tax and several other things. So when Herod died, the country was solvent. There's a picture. Isn't that interesting? Wow. We don't have any modern people who have made such a burial place. In Kiram, as a church, and that's about it. I honestly say I never take students to this place, although it's perfectly okay. There are other places in the same area, Abu Ghosh, which means Father Spirit, where they think that it was the same as Emmaus, the walk of the men from Jerusalem to Emmaus. It's all in these areas, but you can see that the hills are terraced. Maybe you can't, and you can see the church where supposedly Zechariah and his wife would have had their dwelling place. Now I put this one slide in just to show you. See those red lines? Those are all walls that the Israelis have put up so that the Palestinians and the Israelites don't have any contact. And to get to Bethlehem, you have to really go around, circle around these walls. You're going to experience at least that. On day 8, how are we doing, Pastor? Oh, that's not much. So I better hurry up. Day 8, that would be the last full day that you pilgrims are going to be in Jerusalem, is a walking day. And basically this is the one that mirrors Passion Week. You're going to start out from the Mount of Olives and walk down this road, which they call the Palm Sunday Road. It was in that general area. Remember how Jesus went down on a donkey, and he went down into the Kidron Valley, but no way that it was this exact road. You can see the Dome of the Rock, the walls of the city are in that area, coming down from the Mount of Olives. This church is very distinctive. It's the Church of All Nations. It's rather modern. It's interesting. You go inside, you look up at the ceiling, and you'll find the Great Seal of the United States of America. Because many countries donated, and they got to put their emblem inside. But it is the Church of All Nations, and it marks the place where Jesus prayed in Gethsemane. If you go on this side through a gate, you get into an olive orchard, which is much more realistic. You can see what that looks like. Olive trees, you will see olive trees. And they are one of the most ubiquitous fruit trees in the whole Holy Land. By the way, some of these actually are 2,000 years old and may go back to the century that Jesus died. When you come now across the valley Kidron, you enter Herod's Gate, so-called, and almost immediately you come to this Crusader church dedicated to Saint Anne. Anybody know who she is? Jesus' grandmother, yeah. Mary's mom. And so this is supposedly where she lived in Jerusalem. What's really neat about it is a Crusader church, and I hope you get some of the people that can sing, and they can sing, they can know, you know some Latin, right? Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi. Oh, the whole place just reverberates. It's just made for that kind of singing. You must do it. You going?
Mark Ramfin will be working on it.
Behind St. Anne's are the archaeological remnants of the Bethesda pools. Bethesda, that was the place where an angel came and stirred the water, remember the story in the Gospels? And there were these rather large pools. There had to be a lot of water around the temple area because everything had to be washed. And I don't have a slide, but there were aqueducts that came from Hebron, that's about 35 miles away. They came from Bethlehem, and they were built at the time that Herod redid the temple, and they would bring just all the water you needed. This is an aerial view, and it may be hard to see, but you see here, this is called by the Arabs the Haram al-Sharif, which means the noble enclosure. It has the Dome of the Rock on it, the Aqsa Mosque down here, and it has a wall around it. Right on the other side is the Rockefeller Museum, and I just had to put that on there because that's where I studied. And I had to take my wife over to, she was working in a library on Mount Zion, and the Arab boys would, I think you say molest, or they were really after her. So I had to personally walk her to her job in the morning, and then cut through the city and go to the Rockefeller Museum where I studied Jewish coins. That's also where the Dead Sea Scrolls were, and I lived in the room next door and had no idea how close to history I was. There's a place outside of the walled city where the old Jordanian bus station was, and this is a reconstruction. It's Gordon's cavalry. Gordon was a British general who famously fought at Khartoum in the Sudan. And when he came to Jerusalem, Brits were very important at that time. He looked at this particular hillside and said, that's Golgotha. It looks like the face of a skull. And then they, like the Brits like to do, they set up an association in England that promoted this idea, and right behind it is a garden in which there is a tomb like the one that would have been there at the time of Jesus. And so they promoted the idea that these are the authentic places. And I must admit, when I first went there, this is what you pilgrims, especially you first-time ones, will really appreciate, because it gives you an idea of how it might have looked. Because when you get to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you are just as turned off as you were with the 14-pointed star in Bethlehem. But the more I've studied it and the more I've done my own research, I am convinced that the traditional site of the Holy Sepulchre is the place of the crucifixion, not this one. This is the garden tomb, and we would often take students there and have a church service. There's the entrance to the tomb, and gives you, if you will go there, you go into it and you will see how a first century tomb was arranged and where the body was laid out. So it's worth it. Yeah, this is just again an oversight. As we're moving on to this place called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you can see the Dome of the Rock in the distance. They're not that far away. And you'll walk along these city streets, which today they call the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows. And during Lent, you'll see on television that pilgrims are walking along this. And if you had this slide, you'd have the 14 Stations of the Cross. You ever heard that? If you have Roman Catholic friends, in New Ulm, Minnesota, they built this kind of thing so that you could meditate. And they're on here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the last ones are inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. At this particular angle, the church looks, but you don't have many angles like this. This church is plumped down right in the middle of houses and other things. I love this picture because, do you see this ladder here? It's been there since I first went in 1970, and it will stay there. Why? Because they made a legal agreement between the churches. If you have that one handout, you'll notice that there are 6 or 7 churches that share ownership of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Each have their own space, and they don't always get along too well. But they had this agreement, which is called the status quo, and it said you can't move anything. And the day they signed it, that ladder was there. That ladder is still there. This is, by the way, a Crusader architecture, part of the Crusader